Hello and welcome to our chat today about new Batman books. I have one of my friends from the Star Wars Discord server about the expanded universe, Alpha. Is it okay if I call you Alpha?
Yeah, whatever, man.
Okay. And we're going to be talking about just Batman in general, but specifically Batman for newcomers. So to start that off, Alpha, how did you get into comics in general, and then Batman in specific?
Oh, well, in 2013, I saw Man of Steel in the cinema. Absolutely loved it. I was always kind of a DC fan in the background. Like, I watched, the Justice League cartoon in the early 2000s when I was a kid, and Batman the animated series. I think my first Halloween costume was Batman, but properly getting into comics was 2013. Man of Steel. Thought, like, coming out of the cinema, I thought to myself, you know what? I've got a little bit of money with me at the moment. How about I go to my local bookstore, which in the UK is Waterstones, which I knew had comics in it, but I'd never really looked at them or anything. And I just went in and said, you know what? I'm going to pick one book from Marvel, one book from DC, see which one I like, and whichever one I like, I will make my personality for the next 20 years. And so I went in and saw New 52 Suicide Squad Volume 1 and Marvel's Secret Invasion. And I picked up both of them and preferred Suicide Squad, I guess. So ironically, I've read so many books now that I don't even like that book anymore. It's not the highest quality book in the world, but it was enough to get me into DC rather than Marvel. So I did start off with the New 52, 2013, the New 52 was in full swing. So eventually started getting into the Snyder Batman stuff, which, we'll get into it a bit later, I guess. But Snyder Batman is good for the New 52. My opinions of the New 52 were dubious, but it's for the most part, I did enjoy that era of Batman, and it was good enough to get me into liking him to the point where I would say the Batman mythos is probably top 5 for me in all of DC, and you know that I've read quite a bit of DC, so it's quite high up there for me. But as time went on, I started, by the time that Rebirth was kind of getting going, so 2016 odd, I started reading more post-crisis stuff as well, and that really grabbed me. Not just Batman, but Green Lantern, Flash, Justice League, etc. So I started falling more into that era, and by the time of, I think, Dark Knight's Metal in, what was that, 2017 or 2018 or something like that,
I think it was 18.
I kind of stopped really caring about the modern canon, and I'd pretty much heavily fallen into post-crisis at that point, so I more or less swore off the modern stuff and said, you know what, I'm going to read post-crisis. It's bookended, it has a beginning, middle, and end. I can read as much of it as I want. That's it. So yeah,
that's I think it's interesting that in the comics community, comics fandom, there's a lot of hatred for what's dismissively referred to as synergy. The tendency of comics to copy movies and TV show adaptations or even non-adaptations. But I think that it is a true thing that movies do inspire people to check out the comics. I mean, I would say that my comics journey really started when I watched Spider-Man 2 and Batman Begins in 2004 to 2005. I'd read a couple comics before then, but those movies just got me so excited about the characters. I went to the bookstore and started reading trades of both Spider-Man and Batman. So I don't think that comics should necessarily do a ton of stuff to try and like imitate things about the movies. But I don't think it's wrong to think about that kind of thing when you're writing things. So, for example, like here's some shallow examples. In when did Dark Knight Rises come out? It was 2012, right?
2012.
Yeah, so 2012, Dark Knight Rises came out, and there's that pretty cool scene where Batman sets up a bunch of gasoline on the water, the frozen water, and the bridge, and it lights
Mm,
up a bat signal, right?
yeah,
And Peter Tomasi in the Batman and Robin series at the time had Batman do the exact same thing. He lit up a skyscraper with a gasoline bat. And
indeed
people
he
were like,
did.
that's very cringe. And I agree, that is very cringe. So that's the kind of thing I think you shouldn't do. Like,
Mm,
what are you thinking there? Like,
yeah.
someone went to see the movie and then they check out your comic like, ooh, that happened in the movie. I'm like, that wasn't adapted and it feels kind of forced.
Mm,
So that's what I think is the bad kind of synergy. And I would say something like Spider-Man Back in Black, where because Spider-Man 3 came out in 2007, they had a whole year where Spider-Man was wearing the black costume because of Civil War. And it's just like, the black costume was specifically because of the whole Venom thing. It had nothing to do with him feeling sad.
mm,
It felt very forced. But something
yeah.
like, for example, if Bruce is not Batman for some reason because of, say, Batman RIP or Super Heavy, if a movie's coming out, maybe make Bruce Batman again.
Mm,
Because that's not forced, that's just organic storytelling. And you probably know when movies are coming out 3 or 4 years in advance, so you know when your comics are going to hit. So if you're doing a big Bruce is not Batman story, maybe don't have someone else be Batman in 2008 when The Dark Knight hits, Grant Morrison. And this is not because I hate Dick Batman. I actually really love Dick Batman, but that was
mhm,
very poor thinking when the biggest Batman superhero movie of all time. And this is saying, as someone who doesn't even really like The Dark Knight, I prefer Batman Begins. But it was the biggest movie. People still
mm.
love it the best.
Oh yeah.
And people knew, like, the hype for that movie was unreal. People knew it was going to be huge. And Grant Morrison was just like, well, screw you. I'm going to have Dick be Batman and Bruce is going to be in Pilgrim Times.
Yeah. Even though we all know that Bruce is still alive. No, we'll just
Exactly.
have. I mean, it's not like it was one or the other. After Bruce came back, they still had Dick being Batman, and it
Yep.
was just, oh, okay, there are two Batmans now. You know, it's not like you can't. It's not like bringing Bruce back meant that you could not have Dick Bats anymore. He was still there.
Yeah,
So
and
yeah,
it's funny because in The Dark Knight, Bruce does go to, is it Hong Kong or Shanghai?
I think it's Hong Kong.
He
It's
goes
Hong
to Hong
Kong.
Kong
Yeah,
in that
yeah.
big sequence. So like that's pure out of, Batman Incorporated, but that was 2 years later
Mm.
that Batman Incorporated hit. If they'd had better thinking, in my opinion, the RIP saga did not need to be as long as it did. Return of Bruce Wayne did not need to be 7 issues. We could have moved Batman Incorporated forward and had better synergy. But that's a very complicated thing that editorial and marketing really should have worked out then. And
Yes.
Monday morning quarterbacking it now doesn't do much.
Mm.
So obviously, both of us have our opinions about Batman, which is why I'm hoping we have a fun conversation about this. We have a lot of
Mhm.
conversations on the Discord, so I thought it would be fun to do a podcast about it.
Yeah, sounds good.
Um, how do you mostly read your books? Is it digitally or hard copy? I know I've seen your collection of a lot of omnibuses and trades, but do you also read digitally, or what's your
No,
reading
I
habit?
am almost 100% physical copies. The only ones that I have digital copies of are ones that were specifically released digitally, a la the Smallville tie-in comics for the quote-unquote season 11. Those are the
Oh, those are so
only.
good.
Yeah, no, I know, and I still managed to get 3 of them physical copy, but
Nice.
somehow. But no, those are the only DC books that I have digitally. Everything else, my entire collection of more than 1.2 thousand at this point, is all physical copy, mostly graphic novels. Some 90s stuff that wasn't reprinted, I've managed to track down as, single issues for on eBay and stuff. And even then, it's mostly like Green Lantern, Kyle Rayner stuff. I don't
Are you
have
going to
any
get that
Batman
Green Lantern
singles.
Kyle Rayner compendium?
I was not aware that was a thing, actually. Thanks for bringing that to my attention.
Yeah, you should check it out. I think
It
it's
depends what's in
basically,
it. Like
I think
I
it
do
contains the
actually,
first like
yeah.
2 or 3 of the trades they released like 4 or 5 years ago,
Oh,
but
so
it's
I've
all in
I've got
one.
all that anyway. So I have all of the Kyle Rayner trades.
Nice.
It's just the little single issue stuff in the middle. Like for the most part, as far as trades go, I own every single Green Lantern trade from Emerald Dawn in 91 all the way to the end of Rebirth. All of
Nice.
it. The only stuff that I'm missing is a little bit that was never printed in trades of like the Green Lantern and Jade stuff in the early
Aw.
2000s. So I got like a bit of it. I have Power of Ion, Brothers Keeper, stuff like that. There's just a couple trades here and there. I think I'm probably ultimately missing, 10 to 15 issues.
Do you upgrade your collection? Like you'll have the old trades, but then they'll release like a compendium or omnibus, and so you'll sell off the old ones and get the new sort of. It's bigger, but it's sort of more compact because it's one volume.
Honestly, no, but mostly because I don't like getting rid of the books that I've got.
Sure.
I have, in fact, I have a few duplicates. There are some that I do need to sell off because my collection's so big that I forget what I have, and then I'll see something on a market, like a Comic-Con or something. It's like, oh, that looks interesting. Take it home. Shit, I've already got this.
Yep.
Yeah, but no. Aside from that, no, I have occasionally, like, I'll have part of a story and then I'll see a full volume that contains the entire story and think, you know what, it's worth the sacrifice. I'm going to pick this up even though I've already got half of it, just to have like the book that contains all of it. But the way you described upgrading, not so much. No, I do just sort of, I mean, some of my stuff is, reprints. Like I don't, unless something was secondhand off eBay, for the most part, I have the most modern one or closest to most modern one anyway. But, it's just sort of whatever is, for the most part, my series are part of the same run, but sometimes it will just be, you got, I'm just pulling something out of thin air here, but say Nightfall, where I'll have 2 of the modern versions and 1 of the old ones or something like that. I'm not particularly picky about it looking good on the shelves.
Yeah, I think that's a very sensible attitude, especially since DC's trade collection department is ridiculously incompetent about getting things to match.
Mm-hmm.
So, I personally do a mix of that. I have a lot of trades, but I also subscribe to DC Universe Online. Sorry, not what is it called? DC Universe Infinite, and I'm the Ultra tier, which is the most expensive tier because you also not only do you get comics from last month, so most comics are locked to 6 months ago, but if you pay the extra, you're up to 1 month. It also has trade collections, which is nice because it means you get all the variant covers and behind the scenes stuff and stuff. So like if you're like really into reading comics digitally and it's available in your country, which is not universally, which is sad, but I know there's a lot of rights issues that are involved, so it's not a high priority for Warner Brothers to get it available in more countries, but I wish they would because it's an amazing resource. Like the stuff I'm able to read, like if I'm interested in, like, for example, the origin of Man of Bats, the Native American Batman, his origins back in the Golden Age and like Batman 400s. But I can read that on DC Universe Infinite, and that's just fantastic. I don't have to go to eBay and pay like $4 or $5 for a falling apart comic that's probably faded and not readable anymore.
$400 or $500.
I don't think that particular issue is that important. I mean, it is technically a key, but it's not the kind of key like first appearance of Dick Grayson or first appearance of Alfred or something like that. It's I don't think it'd be that much, but it's still just, it would be hard to get a good quality version of that these days.
Though I will say I have spent embarrassing amounts of money on books that weren't really worth it in the end. Like, you remember Ion the Torchbearer for the last Kyle Rayner solo thing ever, so unfortunately. But it was not of the greatest quality, but I didn't know that when I spent £120 on it, so...
Whoa! That's a lot!
yeah, it is.
I think the most I've ever spent was $90 on 2 trades to get Red Robin and Batgirl.
I do need to get Red Robin.
Red Robin is so hard to find. Those you'll probably have to spend a lot. I really wish they would just reprint those freaking trades. Like they did those really nice Stephanie Brown trades like in 2017-18. And Red Robin, you just do the same thing. Now the thing about Red Robin is I will admit the second volume would be tricky because it has like 3 different crossovers that are really difficult to deal with. But honestly, I would just say screw it and just do Red Robin 1 through 26. Just do it, guys.
Yeah. No, I mean, those Stephanie Brown ones, you mean her run as Batgirl?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, no, those were fantastic stories. I did really enjoy reading those a couple of years ago. I did a read of my, at the time, entire post-crisis Batman collection, and of course included Cassie Kane Batgirl and Stephanie Brown Batgirl, and what little I had of Dick Grayson Nightwing, etc., etc. So it does really enrich the story to have those characters pop up every now and then.
Yeah. Speaking of characters, you mentioned Kyle Rayner, who's obviously one of your favorites of all time. But what are
Mm-hmm.
some other favorites of characters, and also writers, artists, and stories that you'd pop up? Top 10 type stuff.
Yeah. Well, my top 5 mythos, and I mentioned that Batman or the Batman mythos is one of them, so the characters associated with it. But my top 5 mythos, I guess, in no particular order, would be Green Lantern, The Flash, Batman, Superman, and Justice League. And their various iterations, some more than others. Obviously, Wonder Woman, Justice League America is not the highlight of the list, but it was, the JLA, for example, is fantastic, and I can't believe it's not the Justice League was hilarious. But yeah, so among those mythos, favorite characters among Batman would have to be Dick Grayson specifically as Nightwing. Tim Drake is my favorite Robin of all time. He is the best. And it seems DC has finally agreed with that, if the reports I've read on the modern comics are to be believed, that he's now Robin again, isn't he?
He is Robin, but so is Damian, and they're not doing a good job of juggling that. But
well, anyway, the so yeah, those two as Nightwing and Robin. Kyle Rayner is my favorite Green Lantern of all time. Ultimately, I'm a big 90s and early 2000s fan. Basically, everything between Zero Hour and Infinite Crisis is amazing to me. So Wally West is my Flash. He is the Flash for me. As I said, I grew up watching the old Justice League cartoon, and he was Flash at the time, so he was the Flash in that show. So he was my introduction to the Flash, really. But yeah, Wally West, Kyle Rayner. Yeah, those guys would be probably my favorite characters. Wally, Kyle, Tim, and Dick Grayson. But yeah, obviously Superman, big one. I really like Superman. It's just like I don't know. I can't say what exactly I like about him. He's just like fun to read. Like, I know there's some people who don't like him because he's too powerful, and you could say the same with the Flash. I remember early in JLA, I think it might even be the first story where they're fighting against the White Martians, and there's the bit where Wally is being chased by a villainous speedster, and rather than outrun him, he laps the world and punches him in the back of the head. Which, yes, that's a little bit overpowered, but that's not really why you read them. I don't read these comics to associate with the characters. I don't read Hal Jordan and think, I, myself, a fighter pilot, really associate with this man. No, that's not why I read it. I read it because it's fun. And them being overpowered doesn't really bother me as long as the threat they're facing is reasonably, on par with them. And Superman is the same thing. He is... he has a lot of powers, but the people he faces are, terrible and whatever. So, yeah, as long as it's well done, I don't particularly mind if they're overpowered. But yeah, Superman is definitely up there for me. I need to read more Superman. I've sort of bounced around a little bit with him. I've picked up quite a bit of his stuff recently, though. But yeah, no, that's a good sort of hit for characters with me. And Batman himself is obviously quite good to read. I do personally prefer the detective-y type stories rather than him just being the prep time Batman. But yeah, no, and we can get into a little bit more of that talking about his early stuff. But yeah, as for writers, later on, I wasn't a huge fan of Grant Morrison, but his work on JLA, I do absolutely love JLA. It's probably my favorite Justice League era. It ran for 10 years and is quite definitive Justice League, so it is a pretty good one for me. Mark Waid, amazing. His work on Wally West was fantastic. Jeff Johns for both his work on Green Lantern and Flash. Again, later on, not so much, but Jeff Johns' Green Lantern reinvented the character after Kyle Rayner basically shouldered the thing for 10 years, and his work on Flash was also amazing. Yeah, I mean, as for artists, there are some good ones out there, Jim Lee and a few other ones, but the two that really stand out to me, despite being very different from each other, are Darwyn Cooke and Alex Ross. Darwyn Cooke, I really love his sort of simple retro 40s style. I mean, I think I mentioned yesterday that one of my favorites non-canon related stories is The New Frontier, which was very sort of just classic. Like, first time I read it in a single sitting because I couldn't put it down. It was just so sort of cheerful, which is not something you get on a lot of DC stuff, but it was just sort of just fun. And yeah, I mean, New Frontier, it has the sort of retro Jack Kirby type feel to it. It kind of reminds me quite a bit of Fourth World, which was very good. But just the square fingers, square jaws, and everyone smiling while beating the bad guys, while still being a very compelling story. And his work on Batman Ego and Superman Kryptonite were also very good. And then Alex Ross, which is the entire other end of the spectrum, where everything looks, completely realistic. Kingdom Come, obviously, World's Greatest Superheroes. I think he's done a couple other ones. Justice stands out to me. Just sort of, it really screams the whole, like, godlike feel of the Justice League characters, where they do feel sort of larger than life in that artwork style. It is very sort of, I mean, the Justice League especially do feel like a sort of a pantheon of gods, and that really does stand out in that style of artwork.
Yeah. I still really mourn Darwyn Cooke's passing. He was such a talent, and DC never really knew what to do with them. They would sometimes let him do what he wanted to do with things like New Frontier. But like, for example, he was trying for the longest time to get an all ages, just regular superhero title going at DC. And DC was just like, I don't know. I don't think this will sell. I don't know. It's like, it's Darwyn Cooke. People would buy it. Come on.
Yeah. I bought his artwork book.
Yeah. It's just, he was a great talent, both writing and art, and is such a shame that he passed so relatively early.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to choose between him and Ross, I probably would go for Cooke. And it is tragic that he's not able to make anything else anymore. Yeah. Especially with Alex Ross, his stuff takes so long. He doesn't really do entire comics. It's more just like an event every now and then.
Actually, did you read Fantastic Four Full Circle a year ago, I think it was?
I've read almost no Marvel books in my time. I've read a couple things, but most of the stuff that bears the Marvel logo on my shelves is a Star Wars book. So
I would recommend, I don't know if your library has it. I borrowed it from the library. But Alex Ross basically just did his own, is very similar in concept to New Frontier. It's its own continuity, but he wrote and drew the whole thing. And if you like Alex Ross, it's sequential. And it's that same painting, but he's very creative visually. I'd really recommend it if you're a big Alex Ross fan for new work of his. He's still doing, he's still working hard, so I appreciate that. I mean, a lot of people of his style of art, would just do cover work, and he does a lot of cover work. But I was really pleased to see that he did that full circle thing. That was really great, and I hope that Marvel lets him do that some more, because that's the kind of thing that would really. That's the kind of thing you can give someone. It's like, this is a way to interact with these characters for the first time, like new characters. And, is one of the top quality artists of all time. And he gets to do what he wants. And he's actually good at it. So some people like Lee Bermejo, he's not a great writer. He's a very great artist, similar to Alex Ross in being very painted and very realistic. But then when you let him do what he wants, he just kind of veers into trying to copy Alan Moore's sort of deconstruction and grittiness, but he doesn't really know how to do character arcs. He doesn't really know how to do themes. He's very surface level. So it's like you have to find someone who's got both, or someone who can pick a writer who can really enhance their art.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think I will probably have to check that one out. I mean, the Ross ones, I've only got 3 standalone DC books by him, but
Yeah.
all of them are bloody fantastic in their artwork.
Yeah. So speaking of sort of what to hand a new person, that's kind of the purpose of this podcast. And my first question with regards to that is, what is the purpose of a reading list or order that you would give to a new fan? Like when you create these things, what's your purpose in that?
I guess just sort of give a comprehensive, basic list of the early continuity. I mean, I always go for post-crisis, where it's serious, not too modern, and not too campy. With year 1 is it's very basic ground level Batman. You don't really need to know a lot going in. I mean, that's the most important thing with the newcomers. Is whenever I recommend something to someone who's never read any DC books before, is what is something they can read without having to have read another 400 books to understand what's going on. So starting at the beginning of the timeline is as good a place as any to start, because there is nothing else to refer to. This is it. This is the beginning. But at the same time, it's also really good. Year 1 is a world-renowned comic book, so
It is a masterpiece. It's something I'd actually put up there with Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, maybe not Shakespeare, but it's really, really good.
Yeah. Oh, completely. So year 1 is probably the definitive. Well, I say definitive. There are 2 options I give people when I'm trying to get them into DC books, is if they want to do main continuity or standalone stuff, just a kind of warm-up. Like New Frontier is a good place for someone to start if they don't really care about getting into like a fixed timeline, long-term story. It's a brief introduction to the Silver Age characters, Barry Allen's Flash, Hal Jordan's Green Lantern, Martian Manhunter. It gives you a little bit of Batman and Superman, but ultimately it's more about those characters. But that was just sort of like it's a good introduction to characters, stowing them, starting off as being superheroes, and it's a beginning, middle, and end story that is fairly short. So it is a good start point for someone who has no idea what's going on. Year 1 is more if you're trying to really get into the fixed timeline, and especially with Batman. He is, street level vigilante. He's never done this before. You see him come up with the idea of Batman. I mean, he kind of knows he's going to be a vigilante, but he kind of screws it up on his first go around. You can see why it was the source of inspiration for Batman Begins, because it is a good Batman beginning story. It's, he's not the refined Batman. His gadgets aren't all there. I think at one point his utility belt blows up while he's fighting the police. So it is just a good ground level, he's not fighting the Joker or Mr. Freeze or some alien god from the future or something like that. You're not at that point of Batman yet. I don't think there even are supervillains at that point. Superman is barely on the scene himself, so all the supernatural stuff is just not really around at that point. So it is just a very basic story. That's the simplest part about it. It's not very long. It's not particularly complicated. It's, hey, Batman's here. He's going to fight some mobsters. The end. It's simple and easy to get into. So yeah, that is as for reading lists, it's, well, I guess you saw yesterday that when we were speaking to someone on the server, my 2 initial recommendations after that one would be Long Halloween and Dark Victory, because it continues that era of sort of simple Batman. They do introduce some supervillains a little bit in that, and Two-Face's origin, Joker and Scarecrow are in it, but they're not really the focus of it. It is still the mobster style thing. It's Batman being the world's greatest detective and doing all the investigation stuff. It's not a big story. It is just a sort of crime boss story, and it is, like I said, it's fairly early on in his career, so you don't really need to know anything.
So one of the things that I wanted to get into is there is a fairly, I would say that in fandom in the last 20 years, there's shaken out a fairly standard set of recommendations that people give to newbies.
Mm,
And the first three are always Batman Year One, The Long Halloween, and Dark Victory.
mhm,
And I wanted to kind of take a look and see why we choose those and what are some alternatives that we could pick from. So, year
mhm,
one, you've already given a really good reason. You already sort of run down the reasons why we do it. It's the first, it is the first of the new continuity, and it's really high quality and it gives you everything you need to know. And you can stop there and not feel like you have to keep reading. It feels complete, even though you could keep
mm,
reading for fun.
mm,
Some other options are um, there's a detective comic story called There Is No Hope in Crime Alley, which is a retelling of the origin by Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams in the 1970s. It's a single issue, and it is very philosophical, but also very emotional.
mhm,
Um, and it really focuses on the relationship between Batman and Leslie Tompkins, the doctor who's a friend of his parents and really helped him as a boy. But
okay,
as an adult, she's very critical of his violent ways because she's a pacifist.
mm,
Um, So there's one option. You could also do Batman number one from 1940 that contains, uh, in one page, everything that happens in year one, pretty much, including the end of issue one, where the bat breaks through the window and Batman says, "Yes, father, I shall become a bat."
mm,
Um, so Batman number one from 1940, the 1970s single issue. You could also do Tales of the Demon, which is Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams stories about Batman versus Ra's al Ghul, which contains Denny O'Neil's retelling of that bat breaking through the window in the library story.
mm.
Moving more towards modern day, we have Batman Earth One by Jeff Johns and Gary Frank, and we
Yeah.
have Batman Zero Year by Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo. Um, why do you think we should choose year one instead of one of these other options, especially something like Zero Year, which is uh, more modern
Mm,
and very contemporary and action packed, and Earth One, which is what basically the Batman with Robert Pattinson was based on.
mm. So for Zero Year, there's not really a specific reason why not. I guess it's more a personal preference because Scott Snyder, I almost said Zack Snyder, Scott Snyder's Batman is very well done. It is good, it is of good quality, and if it's read by itself, it's very satisfactory. I liked it enough to keep reading Batman after all. So, there's no specific reason why not. It's more that I'm not a huge fan of the New 52 as a whole and the continuity surrounding it and its general handling and wiping away of continuity. I was not a huge fan of that.
Well,
But
here's something I will
yeah.
say about Zero
Hmm.
Year. Batman Year One is 4 issues. Now that because Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli are just masters of their craft,
Hmm.
uh, it doesn't feel short. There's a ton of incident and character and texture. It's not just boom 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 events. There's a lot of texture and feeling and mood that are
Hmm.
created through the art and the writing. So it doesn't feel short. It doesn't feel like you're getting a mini tale. It's a full story. It's rich.
Hmm.
Zero Year is 13 issues in three different trades. It
Yeah.
hasn't, I think they have collected in one volume, but it's a beefy volume. I think there's a lot of fat on its bones. I don't think it needed to be that long. And it's
Oh
very
yes, there was
tied up.
a tie-in for I think every single character in all of
Yes. I don't
DC.
think those are in the trades, but it still was just like so much fat on the bones.
Mm.
And it's also so tied up in Scott Snyder's Death of the Family and Endgame Joker saga that he's telling
Hmm.
that I don't think it stands alone as well.
Yeah. It's yeah. It's not amazing. Like it's
No.
good, it is of good quality, it is perfectly enjoyable to read. and can serve as an adequate origin story for Batman. It has the whole Red Hood thing, which has become a staple classic part of his origin story, or Joker's origin at least. It has a reasonably good villain as the Riddler, who isn't a campy joke as he has become on and off. He is a reasonably threatening villain in that story. But yes, it does drag on a bit too much and is a bit too much flash action rather than, as you mentioned, story and, substance of year one. Year one, I mean, to be perfectly honest, when you said it was only 4 issues, I thought to myself, is it only 4 issues? It feels longer than that.
It's just
But
so dense. That's the thing.
yeah, it's it's a good, solid story, beginning, middle, and end, but still very rich and shows how much Gotham really needs someone like Batman, because I think early on, before he's even decided to become Batman, he's just sort of, I think he calls it scouting out the enemy territory or something like that, where he's wandering around, I think, like the red light district, and just seeing how terrible this place really is and how much it needs someone to beat the snot out of some villains. So yeah, it's Zero Year is, yes, it has the Red Hood gang, I think they're called, which yes, they're villains, they need to be beaten. But I don't think I really got the same level of sort of dirty, corrupt, decadent Gotham that needs fixing from Zero Year as I did in year one. So I feel like there's more of a need for a Batman in that story, especially with considering how it's those first few stories are about him fixing up the corruption side of Gotham before all the supervillains show up. So yes.
What about something out of continuity like Batman Earth One by Jeff Johns that, as I said, is sort of the foundational text for the Batman movie?
Mm-hmm. Earth One is, I have an interesting relationship with Earth One in that I can never be entirely sure if I like it or not. Where it's good and it's well made, but the whole point of Earth One is it's everything you knew, but slightly different. Where Batman is not some ninja detective, he is just a rich guy that's really, really angry about things. And I don't know if that is a good introduction to Batman, because ultimately, in main continuity, that's not what he's like. He's not some angry rich kid who doesn't know how to fight or doesn't know how to be a detective. He is a detective who knows how to fight people. So it's Earth One's Batman to me comes across as a bit of a spoiled brat half the time, and I'm not totally sure that I like it. It is a perfectly enjoyable story to read, but it's not what I would want my first impression of Batman to be.
Okay. Yeah, I would tend to agree. I just wanted to propose those things. And I would say I have no actual disagreement with year one as our first text that would give someone. Actually, it was funny. So there's another text that I would recommend that very few people have read these days. It's called Shaman. It's the first arc of Legends of the Dark Knight from 1988, and it's by Denny O'Neil. And I can't remember the artist, but he did a really good job of imitating David Mazzucchelli. But it's basically a direct sequel to year one, and it's very focused on Bruce's experience becoming the Batman and how his training experience sort of informed that first year. So the reason, so I actually did this was an experiment I ran on a friend, and if you are a friend of mine, I apologize. I do like to run experiments on people where I'll give you a book that maybe isn't the most popular thing to see what you think of it. But this was kind of funny because I gave someone year one and then I also gave them Shaman to read. And they read both of them like, I like Shaman better because year one was more of a Jim Gordon story and Shaman is a Bruce Wayne story. And I thought that was a really interesting and true thing to say. Like one of the reasons I love year one is it does focus so much on Jim Gordon, makes him so lovable. He's very flawed and gritty, but he has integrity. Like he's a great character. But it is at least equally a Jim Gordon story to a Bruce Wayne story. And if you really want to just get into Bruce Wayne, then something like Shaman may be more interesting to you because it seems like less of a side character. Now, I think Jim Gordon is a main character, but
yeah, Yeah, and for a similar vein, when asking people if they want to get into the mainline stories or the non-canon Elseworld type stories, one of the best recommendations I can give people is Batman Ego with Darwin Cook. Is a Bruce Wayne story. It's fairly short. It's got amazing artwork. It really focuses on the psychology of Batman. It's not an origin story. He's already Batman by this point, but it is still a very good introduction to understanding the character. So yeah, it's that is a good recommendation to give people, I guess.
Yeah, Ego is fantastic, and for those who are interested, it is also a very inspiring book for the Batman 2022 with Robert Pattinson. He actually talked
Mm,
about reading that when he was preparing to play Bruce Wayne. And of course, the art is just phenomenal. Like Darwin Cook was a master.
mm.
So let's move to our second book, where we're going to have a little more disagreement because most people will say The Long Halloween. Why do you? Why would you say we should pick Long Halloween as our second follow up to Year One?
It's a little. It depends what kind of reading list you're trying to get into. So, Long Halloween is the natural recommendation for a lot of people because it is more or less a sequel to Year One. A little bit of time has passed. He's been Batman for a while. He's working with Jim Gordon and Harvey Dent's pre Two Face, and he's working to take down the mob. There's a lot of reference to Year One. It is a necessary sequel to it. In same way as why it was the inspiration for all the mob boss stuff in the movie The Dark Knight as a sequel to Batman Begins. The comics are a natural sequel, so of course they use it for the same way for the film. It's another fairly self-contained book. It's a bit longer. I think it's 12 issues, one for each month of the year.
I think it's 13.
Oh, well, even so then. But it is quite a bit longer than Year One. It goes into a bit more detail into Batman and, the kinds of villains he's facing, because not only are the mobsters in this story that, yes, they are the focus, it's essentially Godfather with Batman, but you do still have supervillains in this story. They are around now. The mobsters start talking about how these new villains are a bit weird. But you have Joker, you have Poison Ivy, you have Scarecrow. Eventually, you have Two Face, you have Killer Croc, a few different other ones. So it's starting to. I guess it's a good middle ground story for getting out of the mobster style Batman and into the supervillain era of Batman while still keeping things fairly simple. So, yes, it's a good sort of bridging story, I guess you'd say. However, if you are looking to stay more in that realistic, grounded Batman for a little bit longer, there are some other stories from the era that's dealt with him dealing with more normal human villains, I guess you might say. There's Batman Prey, which is a good one. I think that one's also a direct sequel to Year One, where he's dealing with the mad psychiatrist Hugo Strange. There's the Mad Monk, which is him dealing with a cultist of some kind. There are a few other ones that are more grounded and realistic without dealing with all the supernatural stuff. There is obviously The Man Who Laughs, which was the Joker origin of that era, which, again, another good sort of grounded one that is a bit of a bridge for getting into the supervillainy type stuff, dealing with Joker doing his first sort of murderous pranks on people. And that one is also fairly short. But I think I come back to The Long Halloween because not only is it a good, simple story and, a good bridging and everything else they've been talking, but it's just good. It's a good detective story. It's enjoyable. It's, a page turner. And I guess that would make it a good sequel to Year One.
Yeah, I think that's a really good reason. I think something that you didn't mention, but I'm sure when I say it, you're going to agree completely, is
Mm.
it's also drawn by Tim Sale.
It is.
He was
Oh
one of the
yes.
masters. Who, again, like Darwin Cook, he recently passed away, and that was a great loss.
Mm,
He was just he was another talent, very different than Darwin Cook, very kind of expressionist, whereas Darwin Cook was very cartoony. Um, Tim Sale was very expressionist. He had really exaggerated features and exaggerated proportions and anatomy and composition, but it all worked. He was able
mm.
to really put his vision forward powerfully, and it is stunning visually. Um, I think what you say about the transition between Batman versus monsters and Batman versus supervillains is a really good reason to recommend Long Halloween.
Mm.
I personally am not a huge fan of the story for the writing because I think that until the final issue, I think it's actually really gripping and it's all making sense. But
Mm.
then in the final issue, Jeff Loeb attempts to do a bunch of extra twists, and I think the twists actually destroy the coherency of the story.
I could
Um,
see that. Is some of the final twists with Harvey Dent's wife and a couple of things I was finding myself going a bit, what? What are you talking about? But ending aside, it does. I feel like it didn't detract from the quality of the overall story. It is still a good story, even if its ending is a little too many twists and turns. I feel like I'm reading something written by M. Night Shyamalan. But yeah, no, it's still good, especially for a first time reader. If you like sort of a Batman detective story, or if you're just a fan of mystery stories, or The Godfather or anything like it, then, like I said earlier, it's The Godfather with Batman in it.
how do you have you read Year Two and Year Three?
I have read Year 2, and I almost entirely disregard it from my list because, well, Batman using a gun and him fighting against the police in a it doesn't feel like a sequel to Year One at all. The only thing it has in common with it is the fact that it has year whatever on the title. That was about it. Other than that, it felt like one of the older 70s comics. You know, what's it? What was his name? Neil Adams? Yeah,
Hmm.
it felt like one of his stories more than anything else. It didn't really grab me anywhere near as much as any of the other books we've talked about so far. I honestly don't think I enjoyed it all that much, and when I do make entire lists of the era, I specifically preface with Year 2 that you can read it, but it becomes non canonical after 0 hour anyway, so why bother?
I actually really like Year Two, and I partly because I like being contrary. I will sometimes
Mhm.
tell new people to read Year Two instead of Long Halloween because, as I said, I'm not the hugest fan of Long Halloween myself.
Mm.
Um, it's also, I would argue, probably the inspiration for Batman Mask of the Phantasm.
Oh,
If you
yes.
read Year Two and then you watch Mask of the Phantasm, you're like, these are kind of the same story. Um,
These are exactly the same
they are
story.
exactly the same story. um, it's interesting. Peter Tomasi did a Batman annual about 3 4 years ago that actually revisited Year Two,
Mm.
not super effectively, which in your perspective would be fitting since the original story is not very effective. I personally think Year Two is actually really fun. Year Three, on the other hand, well, okay, let me talk about the gun thing. So the
Mm.
gun thing was actually very deliberate because Batman in the 40s and 50s did use a gun sometimes,
Oh,
and
I'm well
so
aware he used lethal force just as much as
yes.
Superman did back in the day.
Yes. So Year Two was an attempt to sort of incorporate that element into Batman's origin while still committing him to the no kill rule. Um, it's actually really interesting. I've been reading the Dark Knight Detective series. I got these all from the library because the latest volume was
Oh,
just
crikey.
collected, and these are basically everything from Batman Year One or Infinite Crisis. Sorry, not Infinite Crisis on Infinite Earths
Mhm.
to 1992. So it's about 6 years of comics of detective comics published
Mhm.
sequentially, and it's really
Okay.
interesting because uh, the first 3 volumes take place when Jason Todd is Robin. And Batman's
Okay.
kind of cheerful and he really loves Jason, and it's actually really nice. It's funny because in the Batman run, that's when you get things like the Diplomat Son, where Jason's very dark and very tormented. But
Mm.
Jason in Detective Comics was very classic Robin. He was kind of a copy of Dick.
Mm.
But then when he dies off screen, if you're reading this series, because that was in, I think, Batman, Death of the Family, I think is
Yeah.
issues of Batman.
Yes, it is.
So he dies, and then it doesn't explicitly talk about how Batman is upset because of Jason dying, but you see a lot of Batman doing things like, you remember in Batman Forever when Batman throws Two-Face's coin off a cliff and Two-Face dives after it, and you're like, does that really count as not killing? Because it feels like he's killing. Batman literally does that in Detective Comics in the late 80s,
Ooh.
early 90s. He does that multiple times.
Huh.
So he's really bending the no-kill rule after Jason dies. And I think that was on purpose to show that he was in a really dark place for a couple years. It's been a really interesting thing reading these books. I don't know if I personally would recommend that as essential new reader stuff, but it is really nice that DC has made these available for those who want to read sequential Detective Comics. It really immerses you in the period and exposes you to a lot of people who you may not have heard because they're dead now. But year 3 is very much dated. It is a Robin origin story, and that is what Dark Victory is. So year 3 and Dark Victory are directly competing for each other. I would say Long Halloween and year 2 are also directly competing for their spot in what to read after year 1. I think in terms of both of them deal with the transition from mobster to more costume vigilante. And that's kind of the key thing that you do the sequel to year 1, because year 1 is so intensely focused on the Batman versus normal corruption and normal mobsters. So how do you get from that to Batman fighting the Joker, fighting Two-Face, and so forth? And I think year 2 and Long Halloween provide an answer to that. Long Halloween, I think, gets the victory because it is I really think it's the art. I think Tim Sale really elevates it to another level, even though I'm not a huge fan of it. I do love just looking at the art and reading how he does the action and the emotions. And I would say it is worth reading. I'm just not sure if I personally would hand it to someone because I don't like it.
Yeah.
So year 3, I think there really is no contest, unfortunately. I wish I had a better thing to say about year 3, but it's not good. I think it's Marv Wolfman, and Marv Wolfman can be really good, but he can also be really iffy. Like just
cough, cough, Donna Troy, cough, cough.
You mean Donna Troy's husband?
Yes.
Yes. Like the thing is, like we cannot take away the fact that he and George Perez wrote a run of Teen Titans that is beloved to this day, foundational for a ton of adapted works like the Teen Titans cartoon and a bunch of other stuff. Really set in stone a bunch of characters and world building aspects of the DC universe that are still functional today. And he still can write a really good comic. I liked his Raven at the beginning of Rebirth. I can't remember if he's done anything. I'm sure he's done stuff recently, but he's getting up there in years. But he did an origin of Superman called Man and Superman that was released recently. He actually wrote it back in like 08-ish, but it was only released in like 2019, 2020-ish.
Oh, nice.
Really worth reading. It's basically a 4-issue miniseries that does the origin of Superman. Very worth reading. There's a ton of origins of Superman, but I think this one actually does.
Yeah, I'll add it to my list of origins of Superman.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it would technically be post-crisis because that's what he envisioned it as.
Okay.
But Wolfman, when he's writing Batman, I think his heart wasn't in it as much. And I think that really shows in year 3. It just feels kind of messy. And I could be completely wrong. It could not be Wolfman. It could be someone else. But Dark Victory is a Robin origin, and that's why people recommend it. It is a better story. It doesn't have the same plot problems that Long Halloween does. I don't like it because it specifically does a couple of violent things that really unsettle me, that I don't enjoy reading. And I know that's like the point, but I think that my reaction to them is stronger than the writer intended it to be. And that's a personal thing. This is not me saying it's bad. It's just I don't enjoy reading that story because of those things. It is a good Robin origin story. It's way better than All-Star Batman and Robin by Frank Miller and Jim Lee, which is also supposed to be a Robin origin story, but I would not hand that to anyone.
No.
Except I would say, look at the pretty pictures, because Jim Lee drew his heart out on that book.
But I would hand it to someone looking to start a fire.
You and Biz and Legacy of the Force. It is
Yeah,
a
no,
terrible
it's
series. I don't disagree at all.
no, it's I know it's supposed to be an origin for the Dark Knight Returns, but no,
It is something
please.
else.
Yes, it is something else indeed. No, Asbar is not going to be on my recommended list anytime soon.
No, me neither. So for Robin Origins, I wish I could say Robin Year One, but Robin Year One's not actually an origin story. Robin
Mm,
Year One is a story that happens to Robin in Year One. And it
yes,
is a great story with great art, but it's not an origin.
no, it is good reading material, especially if you
Yes.
plan on reading a lot of Dick Grayson stuff, because the events of Robin Year One come up again in, I think it was Dixon's run of Nightwing.
Well, that would make sense since Dixon and Beatty wrote it.
Yes, well, yes, of course, but the fact that they bring the villain back again, I think
Hmm.
his name was Shrike or something like that.
Yeah.
The fact that they bring it up again, it makes it good reading material for Nightwing, and of course of Robin himself. But it is, I'd say, Robin Year One itself was the solid leap into costume supervillains, because they start. I think the story involves them fighting Two-Face, Killer Moth,
And Mad
brightly
Hatter.
colored. Yeah, and Mad Hatter. These are like the brightly colored costume guys. And aside from Two-Face, you don't really get any sort of like mobster type criminals. I mean, even Two-Face, he's not really a mobster type criminal, but he's not as flashy as Killer Moth.
Right.
Oh, God, I don't think anyone's as flashy as Killer Moth. But yeah, no, Dark Victory is another one of those bridging the gap ones where you get the brightly colored costumes. More specifically, with this is Robin himself, the brightly colored costume. It's pretty much the end of the mobster era, I guess you'd say,
Hmm.
because well, I don't think there are many mobster characters left at the end of that story. But
I mean, they bring new ones like Genevieve Valentine's Catwoman run in 2014 does a
mm.
really good job with the mob. And this is not a recommendation. I'm just saying this is something that is available. Jeannie Howard's current run on Catwoman does have a lot of mobsters. It sucks. Don't read it. But there are still mobsters. Is all I'm saying.
Yeah. Oh, Batman Eternal did quite a bit of stuff with the
Oh, I
mobsters. And
love
they did.
Batman Eternal.
Mm. No, I absolutely love Batman Eternal. I think that's probably, of the entire New 52, I think that is something that I could just sit down and read without worrying about anything else.
Yeah,
For the
I
most
actually did
part.
that. I actually stopped reading DC Comics in 2012 because of the New 52 because I had really gotten into the post-crisis continuity and the erasure of it just I wasn't interested anymore. But then Batman Eternal is explicitly bringing back post-crisis stuff. So you got Carmine
Mhm.
Falcone, you got Stephanie Brown, you've got Hush, you've got all these classic post-crisis people in this huge
Yeah.
self-contained story.
Clue
And
Master, what's not to love?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, it's Batman Eternal is a great one, but as far as post-crisis continuity goes, there are not many mobsters left after Dark Victory. At
Yeah.
least of like the mobster families, the Falcone family, the Maroni family, etc. Those guys.
And of course
After
the
that,
Bertinellis got wiped out even before that.
yeah. After that, it becomes just sort of villain of the week mobsters. Like you'll
Yeah.
have a mobster here or there in Nightfall, and then they'll get killed off, and then it's like, oh well, he was just a lieutenant for this mobster, and blah 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 blah. But you don't get the mobster crime family Godfather stuff after Dark Victory, not really.
Well, and that's purposeful because the point of Batman is that he did break that cartel.
Hmm.
So
Oh,
I think that's
completely.
a good idea. I think that it's dangerous to make a regular mobster stick around for too long. Otherwise, you're
Mm.
like, so what's Batman even doing anymore?
Yeah, I mean that's it's a very 1940s feel if you're just fighting mobsters all the time. But I'd say Dark Victory is a good sort of. I've only read the story once, not because it was bad, but just because I only read it in the last couple of years and just haven't really got around to reading it again. But it's a good sort of stepping stone into the larger Batman mythos. You've had your year one where he's just getting started in fighting the mob. You got your Long Halloween where there's some supervillains around, and yes, there is some supplemental material around like Haunted Night and Man Who Laughs and other stuff with villain origin stories if you want to get into it. but you got your Two-Face origin in that, and God, I forgot how much of a main character Two-Face is in early post-Crisis. I think he was directly related to the origins of the first 3 Robins in post-Crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Then, yeah, sorry.
So after we do the trilogy, we have Batman Year One, and
Mhm.
then the transition to costume supervillains, usually Long Halloween, and
Mhm.
then a Robin origin story, usually Dark Victory.
Mhm.
Most people say that we need to do Killing Joke next.
No. I have quite a bit more early years stuff around that era. So going through a list that I have written up that is a little more detailed, doesn't have everything. I am missing things like Batman Prey, but it has a bit more of the sort of, I guess, fleshing out of the era, where you have Batman and the Monster Men, which was another Hugo Strange story set after Prey, where he fights his first, like, supernatural monsters. You have the Mad Monk, where he fights a guy who may or may not have been a vampire. Then you have, it's not really a Batman story, it is a Superman story, but you get Superman Man of Steel, which is his first meeting with Superman and seeing their sort of bromance start. Then a bit of a follow-up, which was set shortly after Long Halloween, called Superman Batman World's Finest, which was a Superman-Batman team-up story of them. I think it was them trying to save an orphanage or something like that. But it is part of that sort of year one Long Halloween Dark Victory chunk of time, where it was just sort of the sort of retro feel of the superheroes just starting out era, and it was very fun to read. I think I read it only last year, but that one was a very good one, and it was, I think it was like, the first time that Superman fights against the Joker and Batman against Lex Luthor and stuff like that. Then a little bit further down the line, just after Dark Victory, because it is still, in fact, in this story specifically, they talk about how the Robin hasn't actually done anything since Dark Victory, that he's still training, is Trinity, which is the first time that Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman all team up together, and you get a little bit each of their various villains. You have Ra's al Ghul, Bizarro, and I think Artemis, also one of Wonder Woman's villains. But that was a very fun story of the superheroes teaming up for the first time.
So this is where I think we're going to run into a little bit of an interesting difference, because your reading list is guided towards exploring, sort of providing a spine to explore the post-crisis era.
Mm.
Whereas my goal in most conversations with new fans is I want to get people as caught up as possible on major events and character introductions and developments, so that they can either, usually it's to get them to be able to read the current Batman stuff. Now, of course, I think most people can honestly just start reading whatever current run of Batman is, starting at the beginning of that. So currently it's Chip Zdarsky. Go back to Batman 125. I think you can just understand the whole run by reading that. Or before that, it was Josh Williamson for a little five issues. But you could read James Tynan's run from Batman 86. Just start at Batman 86. Then, of course, you could read Tom King's from issue 1, or you could read Scott Snyder's from issue 1. I think most Batman runs are written so that people can read them on their own.
Yeah.
However, I think it does help to have sort of a spine of events like, well, where did Nightwing come from? Where did Batgirl come from? Where did these characters come from? What are these foundational events that I can use to read the modern day? And that's a little different from, here's the spine of what happened in post-crisis, and we can dig down to read like Batman Prey, or dig down to read something like the Dark Knight Detective, reading Detective Comics sequentially. And so that is an interesting thing. And so I would personally skip most of those things for the purposes of helping someone to get to modern Batman. But if I were working towards a spine of modern Batman, I would agree you would want something like What is Batman's first encounter with the Justice League? What is Batman's first encounter with these villains, and so forth. So at some point, though, you would need to do a Joker story because everyone loves the Joker. He sells like crazy. I think the two big contenders are Man Who Laughs and Killing Joke.
Man Who Laughs would be my go-to of first Joker story because it is his origin story as far as post-crisis is concerned. It does the was he Red Hood or wasn't he thing, maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. It has, him doing his lethal practical jokes. I think he poisons the water supply, he assassinates a couple people, he's just sort of having a good time. And it is his first interaction with Batman, and as you've probably guessed by this point, my first recommendations for people are usually the first time they show up in that continuity. It's the simplest way of, here is this guy, this is what he's doing, this is why he's doing it, have fun.
Yeah. I actually haven't read Man Who Laughs because I don't like the Joker.
I don't like him much either. I think he's very overused.
Oh, he's way overused, but to be fair, he's overused because he sells. And I think that is a fair reason to overuse him. I just worry that they're going to burn him out.
Well, they did. It was called the New 52.
And then they actually didn't use him very much in Rebirth, except that they overused the Batman Who Laughs, who is Batman plus Joker. And then in Infinite Frontier and Dawn of DC, they're right back to using him too much, unfortunately. I would say, as much as I hate to do it because I don't actually like this story, I would say you need Killing Joke because that is something that DC constantly uses both for Joker and for Batgirl, for Barbara Gordon. And I would not recommend the movie. I would just say, here's the book.
No, never recommend the movie.
No. A lot of people do like movies, watching something, but I'm like, no, it's a short book. Just read the book.
Yeah. I mean, that'd be like recommending the movie of Hush. No. Yeah, no, it's... I'm hesitant to say it's a good story. It's a definitive, memorable story. It's a well-done story, but it's not a story that I sit down on a rainy day and think, you know what, I'm going to read The Killing Joke today. I read it as part of a larger story. It is a little bit further down the line in Batman's, adventures. He has been Batman for a couple years at this point. Jim Gordon's
so technically, I would argue that Killing Joke was actually supposed to be a Batman who is at least 15 to 20 years into his career. The problem the problem is they decided to make it canon, and that means Barbara Gordon is now in a wheelchair. And so they had to move it way earlier than it's supposed to be.
And which is why on my definitive post-crisis Batman list, it happens exactly right before Death in the Family, because in Death in the Family, they talk about Barbara being in a wheelchair. Yes. The fact that the events of The Killing Joke had just happened, canonically speaking, which leads me to Batman's sort of years of suffering, I guess you might say, because he gets, Barbara Gordon gets shot and crippled, and the events of The Killing Joke happened. Then Robin dies. That's bloody awful. Then you get a little bit of middle ground of him just being really bad and beating people up and maybe breaking or bending the no killing rule, like you mentioned before.
Oh yes.
Tim Drake comes in and things start looking a little bit better.
And then
and well, right before that, Superman gets killed.
Yes.
You get, the symbol of hope, and probably the only hope that Bruce actually has left in the world, gets killed by some huge raging monster that manages to tear his way through the Justice League, and then he gets his back broken. And in the sort of condensed timescale of DC, I imagine most of this happens within the span of maybe a year or two. So, Batman's not really doing too great right now. In the span of from his point of view, a couple years, Batgirl's been crippled, Robin's been killed, Superman's died, and now he's had his back broken.
So that brings us to the question of Nightfall. Nightfall is a 3 omnibus project to read,
Oh,
plus
yes, it is.
Sword of Azrael, because I think you really should read that, because otherwise you're like, so why does this guy become Batman?
Yeah. Why
That's
did you not choose
intimidating
the
to hand
Grayson?
to anyone. I think it's worth reading. I have read it. I actually really like the recent trade collection they did for the 25th anniversary, where it's basically 8 trades plus Sword of Azrael. Just read through it, and it's really nicely laid out. But it's a lot.
It is. It drags on almost as much as No Man's Land, which is also quite big. I
No
think,
Man's Land is also 3 omnibuses. So
yeah,
yes,
it's
basically 3,000 pages.
Nightfall begins the 90s for me. I have pretty much the entirety of 90s Batman, which was a very solid chunk of good stories. Nightfall does drag on a bit, No Man's Land does drag on a bit, but they're good quality stories. You know, yes, it probably goes on a little too long, but there was no point where I was getting bored because it was still good. You get Nightfall, which is broken up into, if I recall correctly, Nightfall, Night Quest, and Night's End, which explores Azrael Batman or Asbats or whatever you want to call him, and his not so his fairly quick fall into insanity. Pretty much the moment he puts the cowl on, he starts acting a little bit too violent to be Batman, gets some rocking claws, and eventually starts walking around in a Terminator type suit. But
it's great.
Yeah. Yes, it's very 90s. I will say that much. It's
That was on purpose, because
I know.
there was this whole thing where a bunch of artists left Marvel and created Image Comics at the time, and it was insanely popular. And Jim Lee was one of them. And DC and almost every one of the characters that was created for Image Comics was someone like Spawn, who is dark and gritty, and he killed people because he's serious, and these are bad people who need to die. And so DC Comics looked at that and they're like, well, should we make Batman that kind of person? And Denny O'Neil, who was in charge of the Bat books at that time, he said, no, we shouldn't. And I'm going to do an entire year of comics to show you why.
Yeah. And Nightfall has its other great edition of Bane, the introduction of Bane, who was very well done because, unlike the Batman and Robin film, he is both brute strength and brains. He is brains and brawn, and he is very well done through that. And honestly, I've always really liked when Bane has shown up and been done well, but I think Nightfall is probably my favorite Bane story of all because he is just great. And hell, he does what no villain has ever done before, which is look at Batman's jaw and immediately realize, hey, that's Bruce Wayne.
So what I usually recommend, and I think Nightfall is something that most Bat fans should encounter because it is in Dark Knight Rises and technically in Batman and Robin, but he doesn't break his back. But it's something that people know about, and so I think it's good if readers have a chance to encounter it. But for new readers, what I do is I recommend the BBC radio drama, which is about 2.5 to 3 hours, and it condenses the entire year of comics, and it's really propulsive. There's never a dull moment. It introduces you to tons of classic and new villains. It's got really good voice casting. I think it's hilarious because the guy who plays Tim Drake Robin has a great New Jersey accent. It's really well observed accent work. And it's condensed. You can digest it in just a couple of hours. So it's almost like a movie, but of course a radio drama. But unlike the movies, which, they're trying to be epic and something, it's just, these are what happened in the comics. We've paced it out, we've cast it, we've dramatized it, but this is the condensed and intense version of what reading that year of comics is like. But it's digestible. It's not 3,000 pages. It's just 2 to 3 hours.
God, I can't imagine condensing all that story into just a couple hours.
The guy who did it was brilliant. I am in awe of how he managed to do it. He did a really good job. So that's my thing. I think everyone should experience Nightfall. But if you say, oh, it's 3,000 pages and their eyes glaze over, then I'm like, but here's a radio drama. You can listen to it while you're driving or doing yard work.
Yeah, it is quite a beefy book, I will say, or 3 books or 8 books or however
Yep.
you read it. It
Hmm.
goes on for a while, I will say. But as I said, it also introduces the 90s Batman, which ultimately, after the year one stuff, I think 90s Batman is probably my favorite era of Batman of all.
Let's talk a
Because,
little bit of why that
yeah,
is.
yeah, you get, in order, Nightfall, which, we already said is very, very good. Contagion, which is the plague hitting Gotham. Very good story. Really liked it. Especially if you like Tim Drake, he's in all of these stories.
Hmm.
Legacy, which is basically the aftermath of Contagion and brings Bane back, and is also the first time that Batman encounters Bane since he got his, or Bruce Wayne encounters Bane since he got his back broken. Because ultimately in Nightfall, the only person to defeat Bane was Azrael Batman, not Bruce Wayne Batman. So it is a good sort of run in and see if Bruce Wayne can beat Bane. Then you get the beginning of the end for Gotham, Cataclysm, where an earthquake hits Gotham, levels it, and you see Batman's whole world get turned upside down, quite literally, in the fact that the rooftops that he knows so well don't really exist anymore, and it's him trying to stumble around a city where every building he jumps on could collapse at any moment. And it was such a great change of the status quo. It's not just, oh, the villain's gone at the end of the day, he's gone off to prison, he'll escape again tomorrow, whatever. No, Gotham has been completely leveled, and you're not just going to fix that overnight. Then you get Road to No Man's Land, where, Gotham's being evacuated. It's a disaster zone. I mean, obviously, like we said, it's been completely destroyed. And that leads into No Man's Land, where all the survivors are basically locked inside Gotham and can't really escape. And it's just down to the vigilantes to keep things in line, street justice style. No Man's Land did go on quite a bit. It's longer than Nightfall. It goes on for quite a while. It introduces some good characters. You get Cassie Kane. I think that's her first appearance, isn't
Yep,
it?
that's correct.
Yeah, and that was another back to basics type story. If you weren't a huge fan of the flashy costume villains, No Man's Land is a return to form of the year one style of street Batman, where it's not lots of technology, it is just him using whatever resource he has available, which isn't supercars because the Batcave has been, collapsed. So he doesn't have access to all of his toys anymore. It's just him and the villains have carved up Gotham into their own little fiefdoms, and he has to fight them one at a time and take territory back. It is just him on the streets against, the villains don't have their toys anymore either, so it is just street war stuff. And it was very good. It's just good. I don't really
It's
have a.
really intense because it
Mm,
puts your favorite characters in these really unusual situations, and it is so iconic. I mean, there's a reason that I was my jaw dropped when I was watching Dark Knight Rises and they blew the bridges. I'm like, are they really doing No Man's Land?
yeah.
And they did. Now, obviously, it's very truncated because it's one movie versus an entire year and a half of comics.
Mm,
But that the fact that it's in Dark Knight Rises is another reason why I personally think that even for a newbie, you should try and get someone some awareness of No Man's Land. And my solution to that, again, is actually there is an audio drama. So it's not quite as condensed. It's about 13 to 14 hours. But since it's an audiobook, as I said, you can read it in the car, doing dishes, that kind of stuff. And it was based on the novelization by Greg Rucka, who was one of the main writers of No Man's Land. And he's able to condense all those books into about 3 to 400 pages of prose. And then this company called Graphic Audio actually had individual voice actors for each character plus sound effects and music, so it's basically an audio drama with narration. And so for those things, if again you hand someone, here's 3 omnibuses, 3,000 pages, you have to read this to understand Batman, if they're the kind of person who, like us, I mean, we've done that. We sat down and said, "Oh yes, please, sir, may I have some more." But new people will often be like, "Well, if I have to read that, well, I don't want to." So I'm like, "Okay, well, here's an audiobook, MP3 drive, stick it in your car, stick it in your phone, just read as you walk or work out.
Mm.
And then you have those things. Eventually, I think someone would want to get the granular thing, because when you condense something, you are going to lose little stories like, Huntress helping refugee camps with
Mm.
Leslie Tompkins, and facing Mr. Zaz, and things
Oh, yeah.
like, what is the Penguin doing? What are all these other characters doing? Because the novel really hones in on Batman. What is Batman doing? How is he doing this? So obviously all the external stuff is kind of lost. And there's tons of great stories, like Renee Montoya and Two-Face develop a relationship, and that becomes really key throughout that entire era of comics. But the
Yeah.
novel kind of skips that because it's not Batman, so we got to be ruthless in pushing the story forward.
And that cuts out a significant chunk of the story, because for a large part of No Man's Land, Batman's nowhere to be seen.
Yeah,
And
for
you do get all
100
these,
days, Batman's gone.
yeah, and you do get all these little, like, personal stories with Huntress, and when she is pulling her Batgirl stint, you get Nightwing on the scene, you get Robin on the scene, you get to see
And tons
Batman's
of Oracle just
proteges.
trying to
Yeah.
create an infrastructure to make sure people can live.
Oh, Oracle was one of my favorite characters in that entire saga.
Oh,
But
yeah.
you really get to, with Batman out of the picture, one of my favorite parts of No Man's Land is you get to see all of his proteges really shine without him there. Just getting to see the other superheroes do their thing and succeed for the most part. Like you said, you get Huntress versus Mr. Zaz, and helping out the refugee camps and stuff. You get Oracle building all the infrastructure. You get Cassie Kane coming into her own and becoming Batgirl, and it's all just really good story of exploring the Batman mythos without Batman there for a change.
Yep. So those are, I would say, Nightfall and No Man's Land are kind of the stories of the 90s, and then between them you've got a lot of really good individual events that don't quite rise to that level. What I want to say about 90s Batman is I think it is unparalleled in Batman history, because you have three writers, Chuck Dixon, Doug Monk, and Alan Grant, who's writing, I think he was writing Shadows of the Bat. But you have these three writers who are all working together. They're writing their own stories, but they're also willing to set up each other and collaborate in these events like Legacy and Contagion and Cataclysm. And that's all overseen by editor Denny O'Neil and assistant editors Jordan B. Gorfinkel and Scott Peterson. And that team of three editors and three writers, plus all the people that they had writing the other titles like Legends of the Dark Knight and Batman Confidential and all these other things. And eventually we'd have Birds of Prey, Nightwing, and the Robin. Well, the Robin series was one of the first ones. But you had these core writers who were willing to subsume their egos to work on the same stories together. Starting with Grant Morrison, you have what I call the superstar writer phenomenon, where the writer of Batman basically becomes the most important person at DC, and everybody else has to deal with what the writer of Batman wants to do. This happened with Grant Morrison. This happened with Scott Snyder. This happened with Tom King. To some extent, I would argue that James Tynion was an aberration, because James Tynion, even though he's younger than I am, which makes me so jealous, he is literally like the reincarnation of Chuck Dixon or Doug Monk, because he's willing to work with other people. He has an ego, but he's willing to subsume it to let other people tell important parts of the overall story. And he doesn't insist that he gets to do everything. And I think that's very unusual. Whereas all the other writers I just mentioned, they're very good writers. They're very skilled, but they are essentially unwilling to subsume their ego in a way that they can work well with others.
Yes. You get those eras of Batman as the main character of DC.
Yes.
A la Final Crisis, for example.
So let's jump back. We've sort of skipped forward to the 90s. After you get your Joker origin story, whether you pick Man Who Laughs or Killing Joke, or something like Legends of the Dark Knight number 50, which is unusual, people don't know about. That's the thing about Legends of the Dark Knight. It's got so many key stories that you could use for new fans, but it was never collected, so nobody knows about it. But after that, I like to go into the introduction of the Bat family. So
Yes.
Robin Year One, Batgirl Year One, and Nightwing Year One. The trilogy by Chuck Dixon and Scott Beatty.
Those are all fantastic stories. I do also throw in, as you said, I do like the spine, I guess, of DC. I throw in a couple supplementary ones for Nightwing Year One, which are Second Chances, the introduction of Jason Todd, which coincides with the reason for Nightwing existing in the first place, and also the New Teen Titans Judas Contract, which is the first time Nightwing ever appears, canonically speaking. So yeah, those are all very good stories. Robin Year One, as we said before, is the first sort of wholly Batman versus colored costumed guys. Then Batgirl Year One is more of a Batgirl and Robin story because Robin features quite heavily in Batgirl Year One, but it is another very good introduction story to the Bat family, and especially a very important Bat family member. And, quite tragically speaking, is one of the last Barbara Batgirl stories. You get her introduction, and then a few years later, she gets paralyzed. So there's not really a whole lot of Barbara Batgirl stuff out there. And if you do want to read about her in
post-crisis.
Yeah, in
Once
post-crisis.
the New 52 started, they just kept doing more Barbara.
Yes. That's she got some magic surgery that fixed her legs or something. But yes, for the post-crisis era, if you want to read about Barbara Batgirl Year One is pretty much your only option because she's not even in the costume in Killing Joke. Yeah, no. I mean, she is in the film, but in the
we don't talk about that.
Yeah, but we don't talk about the film.
There's actually a couple of stories that they did in Batman Confidential and Batman Brave and the Bold. One by Fabian Nicieza called The Bat and the Cat, where Batgirl fights Catwoman. I actually don't like it because Fabian Nicieza was in his I'm going to appeal to teen boys phase and has Catwoman and Batgirl run through a nudist, like a sex club, nude.
Right.
And it's just very fetishy and immature.
Yeah.
So I don't recommend it, but people do like it.
Can't possibly imagine why.
I mean, Batgirl nude. But there's another one by J. Michael Straczynski, which is a single issue of Batman Brave and the Bold number 33, where Barbara teams up with Zatanna and Wonder Woman, and they just have some adventures and fight crime for a single issue. And it's one of the last times Barbara goes out as Batgirl before the Killing Joke. And it's nicely done. I like J. Michael Straczynski. I actually have been reading his current Captain America run. I think it's a little too slow. I think he needs to speed it up a bit, but he's still a really good writer. And that issue, there are little bits of Batgirl you can catch throughout post-crisis, but she's really shadowy, unfortunately. In my opinion, what we gain through that is more than what we lose, because Batgirl's pre-crisis stories are kind of weak. But her Oracle stories by Chuck Dixon and Gail Simone are phenomenal in the Birds of Prey series. And that is something I'm really glad that I didn't like the Birds of Prey movie, but it did prompt DC to reprint a bunch of Birds of Prey stories, and I think that is good. So we have all of Gail Simone's run being finished up this March in trade, and unfortunately we haven't gotten all of Chuck Dixon's run, which is a shame because I do really like it. But Simone's run, I think, is really where Oracle shines.
And I think I mentioned a few days ago that I have managed to get my hands on the entire Dixon run of the original trades. Nice. But I haven't managed to get around to reading them yet because a lot of my comics are going into boxes soon. But yes, I am moving soon, so the collection will have to go away. But once it gets back on the shelves, it will be read quite severely. And but I will also be getting my hands on the Simone stuff because I really did like reading Oracle in No Man's Land and in the Dixon run of Nightwing, where she does show up as a supporting character from time to time and was really fun to read about. And to be perfectly honest, my first introduction to Oracle was reading Morrison's JLA, where she, for a brief period, joins the Justice League and essentially becomes superhero tech support. So it was a very... JLA was interesting in that it brought some low-level street-type characters up to the big leagues very briefly, where you get, Connor Hawk's Green Arrow, Catwoman, Huntress, Oracle, people you don't really tend to associate with the Justice League suddenly getting to fight gods and monsters, which was interesting to say the least. I don't know if it's particularly good or bad, but it's just sort of not something you see every day.
Sure.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I really do want to read more about Oracle, as she, for post-crisis, that is what Barbara is doing for, the majority of that era. She gets crippled in, 88? So, that's only a couple years after post-crisis started, and then she is Oracle for the entire rest of it up to 2011.
Mm-hmm. And a really good character. I get really irritated when people are like, well, we don't need Barbara as tech support. We don't need Barbara. Like, what can you even do with that anymore? Everyone has a phone. I'm like, yeah, but what does everyone do with their phone? They call tech support. Tech support is still a very key thing in modern life. Just because everyone uses technology doesn't mean people know how it works. And if writers were willing to do the research, you could tell really interesting stories about a really technically competent superhero.
Yeah, and so many superheroes have that guy in the chair type character, and Oracle is the best among them.
Yeah, and I don't even think she just has to be the guy in the chair. I mean, Chuck Dixon and Gail Simone both were able to get her involved as a more than guy in the chair role. You just need to be creative and think about, well, what did tech support actually do? Like, they don't just sit in the chair. They do research. They compete. They have their own rivalries. Like, all you have to do is think about telling good stories. But no, we must have Barbara in the animated series Batgirl outfit.
Yes. And she is really, really good in No Man's Land. I know we've said it a few times already, but hell, she is pretty much the only thing holding Gotham together while Batman's out of town. So, she really, really shines in that sort of chunk of time.
Yes, and she's a huge point of view character in both the novel and the comics, and that really brings you closer because it's such a desperate situation, and she stands tall even in her wheelchair. Oh, I really love No Man's Land. I know some people are torn on it, and I understand that, and I actually really don't like part of the ending because I hate some of the dark decisions they made to end the series, but it is a reading experience like no other. I would challenge you to give anyone any other run of Batman or a year of Batman comics and reading them and saying, this kind of changed me internally, emotionally. Like this was a huge survivalist story told by writers working together in a way you don't see that often.
And was not just a Batman story, it was an entire Bat family story. You get, even as far as Cataclysm, which was really the beginning of No Man's Land, you get everyone in Gotham gets a little issue dealing with where were you when the quake hit? You get, I think it was Azrael is escorting Bane to prison when suddenly the earthquake hits and he has to deal with tracking him down in the middle of a city that's falling to pieces. And that's just such a good story that you wouldn't normally get. Yes, you've got Batman who's trying to fight all the fires at once, and there is that really good scene where he's in disguise and meets Jim Gordon and says, we usually work together on the night shift. And I really like that little interaction where Jim Gordon realizes that the man he's speaking to is actually Batman out of costume. But just the little stuff like, Nightwing coming over from Bloodhaven and rescuing some people trapped in a train or a bus or something like that that's about to fall into a crevice. You get, Azrael tracking Bane down. You get Oracle dealing with the complete disaster of what do you do as the guy in the chair when the computers don't work anymore. It's all just so good and well thought out, and as a argument for why the book is always better than the film, in that you can always spend more time on things. A series that goes on for that long, I think you said a year and a half of it, is you can spend time with all the little stories, and it's just so fleshed out.
Yeah, completely agree. So after you do the year ones and their supplementary texts, where do you go for new readers?
Wow. Let's have a look. See. So yeah, after the year ones, there's not really after Nightwing Year 1, you get Jason Todd being Robin, and there's not really a whole lot of material for him. There's, Second Chances, his introduction story. There's a Superman story for the man who has everything. He is in Crisis on Infinite Earths, and he exists, canonically speaking, for Killing Joke, even though he never appears in it. But, and then you have Death in the Family, and he's dead. And I think there may be one other, Jason Todd story, and you mentioned there was some of those Detective Comics stories where he's in it being a lot more cheerful than he usually is, but he really wasn't around that long. And I know he was a fairly unpopular character, and there's all the controversy of the fans voting to kill him off, but that's a very brief period for Batman's story. And then you get into the 90s, more or less. I mean, he died at the end of the 80s, and yes, there is a little period where he is dead and Batman's being all aggressive about everything. And then you get A Lonely Place of Dying, which is the Tim Drake origin story. And then you get into the 90s. That's more or less it. I mean, Tim Drake was introduced in 1990, I think it was. So I don't know where to really go for casual fans at that point. But if you've reached that point, you're more or less on the trail of Batman's story. He's not a new hero at this point. He's been an established character for in-universe a number of years. So, and then you get back to what we were talking about a minute ago with Nightfall, Contagion, Legacy, Cataclysm, No Man's Land, and suddenly you're in 2000.
Are there any stories in the 2000 to 2011 period to wrap up post-crisis Batman that you would say are on your spine of post-crisis Batman?
Well, there's New Gotham, which is the sort of return to status quo after all the destroyed Gotham stuff of No Man's Land. Mm-hmm. Then you get, there's Officer Down, which is a great Jim Gordon and Bat Family story, which is Jim Gordon's been shot and we've got to figure out what's going on. And again, another sort of return to the status quo. Then you get into the Murderer Fugitive duology, which is another sort of investigative story and less on the costumed supervillain thing, more on the who murdered XYZ, let's figure it out, and Batman continuing his train of pretending he doesn't like the Bat Family very much, which goes on a little too much, I think, where at the end of in the 2000s, I noticed a bit of a pattern while reading these stories, that at the end of each story, Batman would say, you know what, you guys were right all along, I need to work with the family again. And then in the next story, he'd go back to not liking them, which I didn't like very much. But yeah.
Yep. That pattern unfortunately continues through the 2010s and now in the 2020s. In the 2010s, you had New 52, then Scott Snyder does Death of the Family, and Batman's all by himself, and he pisses everyone off. And then Batman Eternal, after about 2 years, wraps everyone back together again, and people are sort of together again. And then there wasn't really an event that broke up the Bat Family in Tom King's run, but it was very disconnected because no one was really talking to each other. But then we have Alfred's death at the end of Tom King's run, and then James Tynion spends 2 years trying to put everyone back together again. And now Chip Zdarsky and Teenie Howard have done Gotham War, which breaks everyone back up again. So like it's this rinse and repeat cycle ever since, I would argue, Bruce Wayne fugitive murderer, which is really where I think that cycle started.
Mhm.
And that's partly because there are so many Bat Family, and writers aren't really great at figuring out how to use them effectively. To which I say, well, you don't want to use them effectively. Just say they're in the background. You don't need to use them.
Mm. But a story that I say did use the Bat Family fairly effectively, which leads us back onto the main trail here, is Hush, which
Mhm.
is another very good detective story. You get use of Catwoman, who a very main character. I think Hush is probably the moment for me where she really truly becomes a member of the Bat Family rather than an outlier. Yes, she does kind of fall off the wagon a little bit at the end of the story, but she became a main character for me there. With
Well, the interesting thing about Hush is that's treated like it's when Catwoman finds Bruce Wayne's identity. But
Mm.
in 1988, Catwoman and Bruce are in love, and Catwoman's just like, "Oh, Bruce." I'm just like, "Wow, well, I guess they used to think that Catwoman knew his identity."
Oh no, you just got to say it
I
was
think
0
wasn't it
hour
Zero
or
Hour just
something. Yeah.
erased everyone's memories?
Well, yes, it was 0 hour affecting Batman. Essentially made him, up until 0 hour, he was a known vigilante on the streets like Superman. And then 0 hour, he's suddenly a urban legend again. And that's pretty much the only reason I read 0 hour, or would recommend it in any capacity whatsoever, is to explain why at some point between Nightfall and Cataclysm, suddenly no one knows who he is anymore.
That's such a
That's,
weird thing to be. I don't know what they were thinking there.
yeah, that was I would at least like some explanation in the Batman story, so you're not required to read 0 hour, because, well, being required to read 0 hour is not a very nice thing to do to someone. Then you get probably one of the only event stories that I will mention that's not a specific Batman thing, but is quite significant to him and what he ends up doing a bit later down the line, is Identity Crisis, which I know it's a very hit and miss story with people. It's not the most popular thing in the world, and what it did with some characters is not particularly popular for very legitimate reasons, but it does affect
Justice for Stu
Batman.
Dibney.
Yes, quite. But what it does to Batman and breaking his trust with people very significantly affects what he does a bit further down the line. Then you get War Games, which I'm sure you have some very strong opinions on as a Stephanie Brown fan.
The funny thing is, I actually started reading Batman comics right after Batman Begins came out in 2005, and that's right as War Games was coming out in trade. And so I was reading War Games as it came out, and so it's a very formative text for me. But similar to like your view of the New 52 Suicide Squad, I kind of look back and I'm like, "Yeesh, I don't know if I would tell someone to start where I started."
Yeah. War Games is a good enough story, but it's not something that I specifically, like Killing Joke, I don't sit down and think, you know what, I'm going to read War Games today. It's good, but it's not like amazing. And the big part of it is what happens to Stephanie Brown, which is she briefly becomes Robin and then supposedly gets killed. And yeah, that is the standout thing for War Games for me. I can't even really remember what the main story is actually about. It's something to do with Black Mask and, riots or something like that. And I know it's when the GCPD stops liking Batman. But yeah, that's about it. It's I don't really know what I think about War Games. It's fairly vital to the storyline because it does affect things, as I mentioned, but it's not like a standout story to me. I don't know. I mean, you said it's a very formative story for you. I don't know if you remember it a lot better than I do, but yeah, I can't really remember what I think about War Games. It's been a while since I read it anyway.
I've read it, I want to say 2.5 times. Once when it was coming out, and then once when I was writing up the pieces for the Stephanie Brown Wikipedia. And I think that it has a lot of really good things in it, but I think that the ending where they kill Stephanie Brown is just so unnecessary. Because to me, when I was reading it the first time, I was like, oh, well, Steph is a character who screwed up and she's going to have to be put on the path to redemption. But no, Steph screwed up, and then they murder her, and I was like,
Mm.
ooh, that doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
And I think that honestly, that not feeling right was really widespread among Batman fans, and that is why DC felt guilty and made her Batgirl 4 years later.
Mm.
Um, which is why, even though a lot of fans are like, we should never remember that because it was bad. I'm like, yes, but we wouldn't have gotten the good of Batgirl without the bad of her betrayal and mistakes and attempts to redeem herself in war games.
Mm. Yes, then as a little bit of supplementary reminded to me by War Games is a very short but very, very good series of Gotham Central. Gotham Central, if anyone doesn't know, is basically police procedural NCIS type thing, but it's the Gotham PD, and every now and then Batman or a supervillain will show up and they'll just have to deal with it while also just being normal cops. Jim Gordon's not really in it. Renee Montoya's in it, but Harvey Bullock is kind of in it, but not much. The rest of them are original characters, and it's just fun. It's very gritty, down to earth. It's police doing a raid on a heroin addict, and then they'll show off and find out he's just been killed by Mr. Freeze. What the heck do we do now? Or Joker standing on a rooftop with a sniper rifle, just randomly shooting people. What do the normal police deal with there? And it was a very fun series. I almost wish it had gone on quite a bit longer, but it probably would have got a little bit repetitive after a while. But I still liked the characters in it, and they felt very real, and their responses to these outrageous situations was very realistic for me. Then getting back onto the Batman path, the next big thing is Under the Red Hood, which is the return of the hitherto dead Jason Todd, which is another pretty good story, pretty memorable story, and probably one that I feel is recommended to a lot of newbies when they don't know who Jason Todd is. It's I've seen it in person recommended to someone who's never read Batman before. Oh, you should read Under the Red Hood. That's good. Okay, who's Robin and why are they talking about him being dead when he's in this story? When people don't even know that there is more than one Robin.
This is one of the reasons why I actually think that, unlike The Killing Joke, the Under the Red Hood animated movie is actually really well done because it does give you the context of who Jason Todd was as Robin, in addition to giving you his resurrection story.
Yeah.
And I actually would recommend the animated adaptation over the comics unless you are someone who's going deep. Again, this is sort of like if you're a newbie, I would give someone the Under the Red Hood animated adaptation instead of handing them both
Death in the Family.
Death of the Family and Under the Red Hood. Because it's much more integrated and it's much more digestible. Once they're an established person and they're just really wanting to dive deep, that's when I would give them those comics. And I would say, if someone starts saying, oh yes, and Under Red Hood is one of the essential things that new Batman fans have to read, that person's a Jason Todd fan.
Yes.
Which, I'm a Stephanie Brown fan. You're a Tim Drake fan. We all have our own favorite Robins, and we all have our own books that we recommend to try and get people into them. But you should be honest about what you're doing there, in my opinion.
Yeah. And, Jason Todd fans are not fans of Jason Todd as Robin because there is no Jason Todd as Robin. There was barely any material of him. Don't lie, you're a Red Hood fan. Yeah. But Under the Red Hood is another good story. It also serves as a little bit of setup for Infinite Crisis, which a lot of stories were doing back then. You get the destruction of Bloodhaven, you get some secret society members, you get little bits like that. But ultimately, it is still a Batman story and was very significant and formative of introducing a new anti-hero of Jason Todd's Red Hood, who, as we all know, is a fan favorite character, whether you particularly like him or not.
He has managed to sustain solos for 10 years. That is significant.
Mm-hmm. And everyone loves him unless you're Grant Morrison, who makes him a villain for some reason. But
well, Grant Morrison is one of those superstar writers, and they tend to have problems, shall we say.
There's a very politic answer there. Yeah, so
So after we get Under the Red Hood, let me think.
Well, after Under the Red
That's
Hood
when
is
we get into
Infinite
Grant
Crisis.
Morrison. Speaking
Well,
of,
yes. Well, you get Infinite Crisis, which is another very Batman-heavy story because you get the OMAC project, which is, a very Batman-intensive thing of, aftermath of Identity Crisis, where he stopped trusting everyone and made an AI super spy bot, which ended up killing a bunch of superheroes,
this was not a good plan.
No, including Ted Cord, may he rest in peace.
No! Well, he's back now, so we don't have to be sad. But he was dead for a good, 15 years.
Yeah, but no, Infinite Crisis, I think... I know I am not necessarily in the majority on this, but it is my favorite event in the post-crisis era because, including all the setup stuff, the OMAP project, the Villains United, Day of Vengeance, and the Run Thanagar War concluding in Infinite Crisis, is a very well done event to me. It did go on quite a long time. It has the big omnibus, but ultimately I think I really enjoyed the entire event. And yes, it does tie into Batman quite a bit, including retroactively explaining how Jason Todd came back to life in the first place, which is something Superboy punches the world, or punches reality, or something like that. But Infinite Crisis was good. You would really need to read Crisis on Infinite Earths to understand what's going on, and that's its own can of worms, because if you've never read anything pre-Crisis, then Crisis on Infinite Earths is a bit confusing. But ultimately Infinite Crisis was a good one. Then getting back onto the Batman run of things, yes, like you said, we get into Grant Morrison, where you get the 1 year later with Face the Face. Out in 52 if you feel like reading it, but Batman specifically isn't in 52, so that's not
52
really
is a really good series, but yes, it is the biggest Bat character in that is Renee Montoya.
Yeah, I mean, the entire point of 52 is the Trinity characters, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, aren't in it. That's the entire point. It's just a collection of side stories for the minor characters, or the B and C lister characters. Green Lantern's not in it, Flash isn't in it, Aquaman, Martian Manhunter, they're not in it. I think Steel is probably the main character of 52. So it's,
and Booster Gold.
Yes, and Booster Gold. So yeah, the B and C lister, like I said, they're not really like the big characters, but they get their 15 minutes in the limelight in 52, which good story. But if you're looking for a Batman stuff, you could skip it entirely and just say, right, he wasn't there that year. Okay, moving on. Yes, then we get into the Grant Morrison stuff with Batman and Son, Batman Rip. Batman and Son. Well, that was the introduction to my least favorite Robin, Damian Wayne, who
he is such a little jerk in that run.
Yes. I know he mellows out, but ironically, the Grant Morrison stuff is actually my favorite Damian stuff. So, and that's not really saying much because I didn't particularly like him in that run. But I don't know. Damian just rubs me the wrong way. He is a bit of a prick throughout his entire existence. I don't really like him very much. Even Jason Todd has his moments. He was the rough and tumble street kid, and was being violent, but because he wasn't as cheerful as Dick Grayson, not because he was trained as an assassin or something like that. Damian also came across as a bit of a Cassie Kane redone to me. We've already had the trained silent assassin who is now a member of the Bat family. Do we really need another one?
Yeah, I really love Damian as a character, but mostly for other people writing him than Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison was clearly writing Damian for two reasons. Number one was Grant Morrison was trying to be really clever in Robin as a 10-year-old fighting grown gangsters doesn't seem like a good idea, especially if you're trying to be gritty and realistic. So I'm going to make a Robin who's trained by the League of Assassins and is a product of genetic manipulation. And he's got the equivalent of 3 PhDs in education. And so this is a realistic Robin for a modern age. And I will say it's clever to pair Damian with Dick Grayson. So Dick Grayson, of course, is the original Robin. He's a much more cheerful and positive and optimistic character than Batman. So having a more optimistic Batman and a darker Robin is clever. The problem is you always knew that Bruce was going to come back. So then you have a dark Robin and a dark Batman. I don't think that's a good idea.
No.
But Grant Morrison didn't care. Grant Morrison's solution to that was kill Damian off. Well, I'm sorry, if you kill a 10-year-old boy off that people have come to love, they're going to come back. And he did. Grant Morrison also was obsessed with Damian as a self-insert character, with Batman and Talia al Ghul as his surrogate mother and father figures, because Grant Morrison's parents were divorced when he was young, when Grant was young, and they were apparently, it was not an amicable divorce, let's just say. And so Grant Morrison decided to work that out through Damian, Batman, and Talia. And I think that Damian's final ending in Grant Morrison's run was very depressing, which I think is a bummer. Thankfully, other people picked it up, but Damian has been so disruptive to all the Bat family characters because, as you say, Damian is a copy of Cassandra Cain. I don't know if Grant Morrison intentionally made him a copy of Cassandra Cain, but it is the same story. And in my opinion, much less carefully thought through.
Yes. At least Cassie Cain had a whole gimmick of not
because
speaking.
Now he's rivals with this kid who's a genius, a super genius, who's super amazing. And like, how does Tim, who's deliberately supposed to be the everyman, compete with super genius power fantasy boy? It doesn't damage Jason and Dick as much because they're so much older and their stories are so much different. But anyone from the 90s is basically trashed by Damian's introduction.
Yeah.
And that really frustrates me, even as someone who loves Damian.
Now we get into some complicated stuff with Grant Morrison, which I feel like is a bit of a given.
As soon as Grant Morrison's name is mentioned, you should expect mind-bending complication and drugs.
Yes, that too. So yes, with Grant Morrison, reading him is weird because he refers back to a lot of Silver Age, Golden Age stuff, which obviously we're not even beginning to talk about here because it's not canonical anymore with the stories that we're reading. But he's saying, you know what, they happened anyway. So it's a bit, ultimately with reading Grant Morrison, the best thing I can tell anyone to do is just go with it. Don't think about it, just go with the flow. If he says something happened, just take it as fact and move on. It gets a little too mind-bendy if you try to actually track down all the references he's talking about. You get into Batman R.I.P. with you start getting back the Batman of All Nations, I think, with it was the Club of Heroes was what they called it in Post-Crisis, where you get the different Batman-inspired vigilantes. You get El Gaucho, you get Knight and Squire, who, my countrymen. You get Knight and Squire being a British-themed Batman and Robin. You get Wingman. You get a few
Man
different
of Bats is my favorite. The Native American. He's so cool.
Yes, yeah. Man of Bats and what's it, Robin Red or something like that?
I think it's Red Raven.
Red Raven. Yes, there we go. So you get Batman of Japan. No, he's not till Batman Inc. But you get a few different sort of, not all specifically Bat-themed characters, but you get a lot of other vigilante characters that they start bringing back in. And I should have mentioned beforehand, but 52 also introduced Batwoman, who has started becoming a member of the Bat family. So, if you particularly want to find out where Batwoman came from, yeah, there you go, read 52. That's your reason for reading it and keeping on track with Batman.
I actually would disagree. I think you should skip 52 if you want to read about Batwoman and read Elegy instead by Greg Rucka.
I own Elegy and I haven't read it yet, so I can't
You
say
should
whether
read
or
it.
not you're...
That one is another one like Tim Sale, where the artist raises it to another level. Like I'm a big Greg Rucka fan, but Elegy's art is jaw dropping.
Okay, good to know. I will put it to the top of the very, very, very long list of books that I own but haven't read.
There's always more to read. That's the thing about this period, is that even if you've read this spine, you can always dig down and find new things to enjoy and read.
And even if you are sticking to the post-crisis, which is what we're talking about here, and post-crisis has ended. It ended in 2011 with Flashpoint, but there's still so much to read. It was a 30-odd year period there, and of not just one series, but dozens of series that started and stopped and started again all the way along that period. So there is a lot of comics to read from the post-crisis era. It may have ended, but there's still more that you haven't read yet.
Oh yes, and thankfully DC is working to provide new trades. Like I said, the Dark Knight Detective series of Detective Comics. They're doing a Tim Drake compendium coming out. They're doing that Kyle Rayner compendium. They are still mining their depths of stuff for people to be able to buy. And even if you're not able to have the space or able to afford shipping, depending on where you are, getting DC Universe Infinite is a really good way to delve into those archives and have new stories to read all the time. Now, I wanted to have a last question, which is, what story would you choose as sort of your finale for post-crisis Batman?
Batman Incorporated.
Okay.
So you have, Batman. We're jumping ahead a little bit, but we are more or less near the end here, where you get Batman.
I mean, Grant Morrison is the last writer for Batman in this era.
So you get after.
Well, I guess you could count Tony Daniel, but nobody cares. Sorry, I actually liked that Tony Daniel run, but it's not very good.
So yeah, you get Batman. Just very briefly running over the gap between Batman and Son and Batman Inc. You get Batman R.I.P., which is sort of, I guess, him fighting against some more villains, and Joker shows up again. The end. Then you get Final Crisis, which is ridiculously complicated. I wouldn't recommend that to a new reader. I wouldn't even recommend it to a veteran. I don't understand it, and I've been reading this stuff for years. Then Batman is kind of dead, but not really, and everyone knows that he's going to come back at some point. But for a very brief period, you get Dick Grayson as Batman, and it is amazing. Highly recommend that
Batman
stuff.
Reborn era, and I recommend checking all of those out.
Yes, you get, and especially Batman and Robin, because, like you said, you get the flip the roles, where you get a light-hearted Batman and a very dark and gloomy Robin, and you get some solo Dick Bat stories like Life After Death, Arkham Reborn, Time of the Batman, Eye of the Beholder, Black Mirror, etc., etc. At some point along that line, Bruce Wayne comes back from the rock he's been hiding under and becomes Batman again. Dick Grayson doesn't stop becoming Batman. They've just got two Batmans now. And then Bruce strikes upon his great idea of let's do the Club of Heroes, but just sort of actively fund it with Bruce Wayne's money. I'm going to go around the world, find all these vigilantes, some of them bat-themed, some of them just, regular people, and then give them an infinite amount of money and say, right, be the best hero you can be. And it was a great, great team story, but it also had a lot of solo act stuff in it. Some of those characters were brought into the New 52. You get, kind of. You get Batwing, who is exactly the same character, except for the fact that they completely change who he is. You get to see more people like Knight and Squire in it. You get El Gaucho again. You get Man of Bats and Red Raven, or Raven Red, or whichever. You know who I'm talking about.
Yep.
You get Wingman, who may or may not be Jason Todd. You get a few other people. You get Stephanie Brown's Batgirl is in it, and she gets that story of where she's infiltrating the terrorist school. and that was a great story for her. Of course, by this point, Stephanie Brown is Batgirl. Read the books. Then, yeah, it's just fun. Oh, by that point, of course, Tim Drake is Red Robin because Damien has usurped him as Robin. Yeah, it's just a fun little collection of stories, some of it teaming up, some of them not, but ultimately very good of just sort of here's Batman, but lots of him fighting against some terrorists. It doesn't really matter who the terrorists are. Yes, they give you a little bit of detail into who they are and what their plan is, but that's not important. The important bit is that Batman is just sort of kicking ass.
I agree. I really like that first volume of Batman Incorporated. The one thing I don't like about it is that it doesn't really have an ending because Grant Morrison wrote Batman Incorporated Volume 2, which sucks butt. It's terrible. And that's part of the New 52 continuity, but it is the end of that storyline.
Yes, and that's another complicated bit where, technically speaking, it's part of the New 52, but also they talk about all the post-crisis stuff. They do talk about how Dick Grayson was Batman, but now he's Nightwing again, and that doesn't really... It's a bit complicated. Ultimately, yeah, Batman Incorporated doesn't really have an ending because the timeline ended, but yeah, it's a little bit annoying, but if you want a definitive ending, do read the New 52 stuff, but it wasn't as good as the first half.
Yeah, it's not going to be super satisfying. My personal recommendation for the ending of post-crisis Batman is Black Mirror. And that's because not only I think... So Black Mirror was the first thing that Scott Snyder wrote for DC. It is a Detective Comics arc with artists Jock and Franco Francavilla. And it's about Dick Batman, although Bruce does show up a couple times. And it is, in my opinion, the best sequel to Year One. It's about 20 years later. And it directly references a lot of those events. Jim Gordon's a huge character. Dick Grayson deals with his own threats and also with threats from Year One. And I just think it's masterfully told. Again, I think the art elevates it to another level. And I honestly think it's the best thing Scott Snyder's ever written for Batman. And it didn't sell nearly as well as his New 52 stuff, but I think it's just much more coherent and satisfying than what he did. Because Scott Snyder, after the New 52 started, he felt he always had to lead to something bigger. So almost every single ending of his stories is actually, and wait, there's more. And that really gets tiring after the third time he does it.
And of course, the villain of Black Mirror, James Gordon Jr., who is a really fantastic villain.
Yes.
Yeah. And a very personal story for the Gordon family. You get a lot of Oracle stuff. You get a lot of Jim Gordon stuff. Dick Grayson's personal relationship to Barbara makes it very important to him. And if I recall correctly, isn't there a little bit of a nod at the end where Jim Gordon implies that he knows exactly who Dick Bats really is?
Oh, yes.
Yes. That was...
And it's funny, reading these detective comic stories from the 80s and early 90s, Jim says almost the exact same thing to Bruce. And you're just like, Jim is always kind of known. But
my glasses. I can't see without my glasses.
Exactly. And I love it. I think Jim Gordon is way more important to Batman than I think most people are willing to say out loud. Because I think that he is the reason Batman doesn't kill. Because if Batman killed, he basically says... the police and the courts are no longer functional enough for me to try and reform them. I'm just going to kill people. And then there's no need for Jim Gordon, because Jim Gordon believes that if he can train and redeem and work hard enough, the people of Gotham can go to a better future. If Batman kills, he says, there's no better future. There's only me. There's only death. And so I think Jim Gordon is the soul of Gotham.
Yeah. And he's a very good, to use a Flash terminology, he is Batman's lightning rod of staying grounded and not being stuck in the high fantasy world of costume superheroes and villains.
Yep, for sure. Well, that brings us to the end of Post-Crisis, and I think we've given readers a really good as I said, a spine to read and
Mm.
different ways to think about what to do when you're introducing a new reader to Batman. I want to really thank you for spending the time with me on my YouTube channel for our podcast.
Yeah, no problem, man.
And thank everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Sounds good.